She's the boss here, Professor.
I get that point.
Yeah. We are humble servants.
Of course.
Boa noite a todos. Bem-vindos a um grande evento que estamos muito honrados aqui hoje de ter todos vocês e de principalmente receber o professor convidado pelo Núcleo de Filosofia Política do Labô, Laboratório de Política, Comportamento e Mídia da Fundação São Paulo, PUC São Paulo, Luiz Bueno, coordenador do núcleo, Luiz Felipe Pondé, diretor acadêmico, e eu, Andréa Koga, assistente acadêmica. Estamos muito felizes e honrados por receber o professor Timothy Fuller, da Universidade do Colorado, grande especialista em Michael Oakeshott. Boa noite, pessoal, que bom. Vocês estão me vendo, a imagem está boa, nós quatro, no caso, né? Que luxo mesmo, Ruth, isso mesmo. Eu agradeço muito a presença de todos, estamos muito felizes mesmo, e a nossa ordem aqui, eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Luiz Felipe Pondé, que vai falar do professor Fuller, vai agradecer e vai falar das Labô Lectures. Vamos lá, professor.
Professor Fuller, I'll go in Portuguese, then I switch to English, okay? Boa noite a todos. É um prazer estar aqui. Essa iniciativa do Núcleo de Filosofia Política aqui do Bueno, nosso colega do Labô. E o Heraldo e a Flávia, que tocam o Flats. E o Heraldo criou, então, um espaço no Flats que a gente denominou Labô Lectures, é disso que a Kogan estava falando. Lá já está a conferência do Furedi, já está o Berkowitz e também estará o Fuller e todos os outros parceiros internacionais que a gente receber aqui no Labô, fruto da iniciativa de vocês, ok? No caso aqui, do Bueno, o Berkowitz foi da Adriana, sobre Hannah Arendt, e o Furedi do Ahmed, né? Do grupo do Ahmed e do grupo da Danit. Agora eu vou agradecer rapidamente ao professor Fuller e vou passar a bola para o Bueno, ok? É isso, Koga? Well, Professor Fuller, good evening. It's really a pleasure to receive you here. I'd like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. For me, it is special because you live in Colorado and I was there, I lived there, near you, Fort Morgan, right? Very near the Rocky Mountains in the northern part of Colorado State. It's going to be a pleasure to hear you talking about Oakeshott, okay? So I want to thank you once more. It's really an honor, really a pleasure to receive you here with us. Thank you very much. Bueno.
So, Professor, with a brief presentation, I'll do in Portuguese, okay? O professor, então, Timothy Fuller, ele é professor de Ciência Política no Colorado College. O professor Fuller recebeu o seu PhD, o seu doutorado, com distinção, em 1971, na Johns Hopkins University. Ele leciona no Colorado College desde 1965, onde, dentre outras funções, ele dirigiu o Departamento de Ciência Política de 1985 a 1991. O professor Fuller tem desempenhado um papel fundamental na edição de obras originais de Michael Oakeshott, dentre as quais nós podemos citar algumas, como, por exemplo, The Politics of Faith and Politics of Scepticism, The Voice of Liberal Learning, Religion, Politics and the Moral Life. Ele coeditou, junto com Shirley Letwin, pela Yale University Press, uma série em vários volumes intitulada Selected Works of Michael Oakeshott. Ele escreveu uma introdução também para a edição ampliada do Rationalism in Politics and Other Essays, e também para o livro que também está traduzido já para o português, que é sobre a história, On History and Other Essays. Politics of Faith and Politics of Scepticism está traduzido já para o português pela editora Ré, né? E com a introdução do professor. Ele também coeditou The Intellectual Legacy of Michael Oakeshott e recentemente ele contribuiu com um capítulo sobre Oakeshott no livro, capítulo no livro Political Philosophy in the 20th Century, Authors and Arguments. Então, além desses e outros livros, o professor Fuller tem produzido artigos, né, sobre o Michael Oakeshott, um dos quais nós tivemos a honra de traduzir e publicar na sala Michael Oakeshott, que é a área do site do Labô, dedicada ao nosso filósofo inglês. I was telling people, Professor, that we have the honor to translate and publish one of your articles on Michael Oakeshott in our website, which has an area dedicated to Michael Oakeshott, which is called Michael Oakeshott Room. So your article inaugurated the room. So I was thank you for that. Então, nossa gratidão ao professor Fuller por estar aqui conosco, que para nós é uma honra. Professor Fuller, thank you very much to be with us, to accept our invitation. So now we have your word, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just one question. I just forgot to say to the people that they are free to write the questions, even in Portuguese or in English. It doesn't matter if you write in Portuguese. Pessoal, podem escrever as perguntas em português, que aí nós fazemos a tradução, não há problemas. E estamos ao vivo também no Oflates, porque o Labô Lectures também está no Oflates. O título da palestra em língua portuguesa ficou O que podemos aprender do esforço de Oakeshott para entender nosso mundo? What can we learn from Michael Oakeshott's effort to understand our world? Thank you very much. Professor, please.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank Professor Bueno for initiating the invitation, and to the rest of you and to all the members of the laboratory for inviting me to talk about Oakeshott. And I also want to mention Daniel Marchiori and Felipe Cardozo, both of whom came to work on Oakeshott with me in Colorado Springs in the past. And I fondly remember those occasions when we were able to work together. Now, my intention on this occasion is first to say something about what sort of activity Oakeshott understood political philosophy to be, and second, what he thought the philosophical study of politics might reveal about the world in our time and place. Now, although Oakeshott never spent much time talking about influences on his thinking, he did mention a few influences that show us something about his approach. He admired Montaigne's essays and often described himself as a writer of essays. For example, he described his masterwork on human conduct as a set of 3 essays, whereas most readers would take it to be a systematic whole. Now, an essay is a tentative expression of how one understands oneself and how one understands what is going on in the world. For Oakeshott, the essay is an act of self-disclosure about how one sees things. It is also an invitation to others to say how they see things, and thus to keep alive the conversation of mankind regarding the most important matters. In such acts of self-disclosure and response, human beings are at their most human. Oakeshott also acknowledged Hegel for understanding our world as the continuous experience of oppositions to be mediated, reconciled only to discover further oppositions to be mediated in the continuous flow of experience which constitutes the historical character of the human condition. Oakeshott did not adopt the progressive theory of history with which Hegel is often credited, but he did adopt Hegel's method of explaining what is going on in the world in terms of fundamental oppositions in search of reconciliation. And I will provide illustrations of this from many places in his writings. Oakeshott described himself as a skeptic who would do better if only he knew how to do better. In this, he invoked the skepticism of Montaigne, along with the dictum of Hegel that the main lesson we learn from history is that we do not learn from history if by learning from history we imagine that the oppositions we must deal with are identical to those of the past and are susceptible to the same responses. The owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk. Our wisdom is largely gained in the retrospective contemplation of what is past. This insight might moderate our tendency to rush headlong into the future, lacking as we do answers in advance. Here also is the influence of David Hume on Oakeshott's thinking, especially Hume's essay on the skeptic. There, Hume remarks that philosophic devotion, like the enthusiasm of a poet, is the transitory effect of high spirits, great leisure, a fine genius, and a habit of study and contemplation. However, Hume says, such a state cannot sustain itself. It must reattach to the actualities of common historical existence. Hume thus recommends a virtuous temper to counteract alienation from the world. To lose connection to the dailiness of life is to lose sight of the weakness of philosophy's claim to authority. And when Hume wrote this, he was recalling the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. Reflection at its best insensibly refines the temper against the illusions of passion and quiets the mind without inducing that indifference which would diminish the pleasures of life. If there is no philosophical cure for the human condition, there may be a philosophical cure for the philosophical ill. The philosopher has encountered problems he cannot solve. Thus, the skeptic philosophizes also about philosophizing, warning against the pretension that philosophy should rule. Hume had already recognized that the age of ideology was dawning, that the lust for abstract theorizing was growing, that the classical defense of moderation was in decline, that philosophers were tempted to become politicians. Oakeshott, acknowledging Montaigne and Hume and deriving his method of analysis from Hegel, thus describes himself as a skeptic who would do better if only he knew how. In this, Oakeshott was formulating his own response to the possibilities and perils of the modern situation. For him, the philosophic examination of politics seeks to describe the character of political activity, quite apart from defending or attacking particular policies. The philosophic examination of politics is not an effort to participate in current arguments, but rather to understand why the arguments take the form they take. Politics is a self-contained manner of activity. It does not require an independent theory to get it going, to maintain its momentum, or to carry out its self-chosen activities. The philosopher, Oakeshott says, speaks in the indicative or descriptive mood, expressing, in other words, what has already been expressed in the words and actions of daily life. The practitioner of politics does not require this exposition from the philosopher, often choosing to ignore the philosophic description altogether. Now, speaking indicatively or descriptively, Oakeshott said that politics is, quote, the activity of attending to the general arrangements of a set of people whom chance or choice have brought together. More specifically, this usually means the hereditary cooperative groups called states. The modern state began to come into being long before us and may persist long after us. We never possess a blank slate on which we may write what we want. To think we can start from scratch is to suffer an illusion. This illusion is nonetheless evident in our world and must be noticed as a feature of the rhetoric of contemporary politics. For Oakeshott, politics springs neither from instant desires nor from general principles, but from the existing traditions of behavior themselves. Arrangements, in short, are neither merely desires nor merely principles. They are a manner of living, a way of life, composed over time by the myriad choices of individuals in the society of each other, establishing practices through which they render their association concrete and humanly possible. Such arrangements, of course, have consequences. They are the product of intelligence, responding to its surrounding circumstances according to its understanding of those circumstances. In responding, human beings discover intimations to pursue, possibilities which are not necessary implications, but present themselves as significant. There are always more such intimations than can be followed at any moment. Choices among the possible avenues of exploration must be made. Political debate makes its appearance here. There is no logically implied direction to be discovered, no self-evidently right intimation among all the intimations that come for consideration. Human beings find their purposes in life in constructing purposes as they respond to their circumstances. All such responses, no matter how far removed from our own sympathies, are exhibitions of intelligence at work with intermittent success. We cannot specify our final goal or the final goal. We may be able to minimize the chance of disaster if, as Oakeshott says, we escape the illusion that politics is anything more than the pursuit of intimations. For some, the philosopher may have a depressing effect when the philosopher is obliged to say of politics, as Oakeshott did say, that men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There is neither harbor nor shelter for floor nor anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel. The sea is both friend and enemy, and the seamanship consists in using the resources of a traditional manner of behavior in order to make a friend of every hostile occasion. Perhaps with regret, the philosopher puts aside the possibility of superhuman wisdom, but also perhaps with relief points to the traditions without which we would fall into a morass of random choices. The emphasis is on the capacity of human intelligence to continue to use the resources of its history. There is confidence that intelligence is not likely to be exhausted. In our moment, the responsibility is ours. It is not likely to be the final moment. And in any case, we cannot act as if it were. We do not and cannot know that, nor can we unmake the inheritance we have. History cannot be taken back, thus we must go on. Tradition, says Oakeshott, is not susceptible of the distinction between essence and accident. Knowledge of it is unavoidably knowledge of its detail. To know only the gist of it is to know nothing. Intimacy with tradition may yield stability without rest. Politics is best conducted in the attitude of energetic sobriety. This attitude results from having grown up hearing the already ongoing voices of one's world and having learned to speak with them. The study of history, properly conducted, will introduce us to the detailed, concrete nature of our way of life and will illustrate on a broader scale what is true of our own experience. The lesson will be that a manner of living indicates how we may conduct ourselves, but not what we are required to do, nor where we are required to go. We may gain inspiration from thinkers and statesmen who knew which way to turn their feet without knowing anything about a final destination. Now, political philosophy, that is, philosophic reflection on the character of politics, may help us to think straighter about the concepts we employ. Here and there, it may reduce the incoherency of our thinking, but it has no capacity to guarantee success in political activity. All of the foregoing reflections may be seen as the effort of a political philosopher to escape from his own occupational illusions by looking directly at the object of his investigation, namely politics itself. There we see what political actors actually succeed in doing. They pursue the intimations of the tradition of which they are a part. They may deny this and seek to do something else. Ideologies promise that we can escape the world we have inherited. Proponents of ideologies can sometimes persuade others that they have escaped this limitation. They can rename the Tower of Babel and vary its architectural nuances. They can attempt to pursue perfection as the crow flies. They can also become cynical graspers after power for its own sake. What finally they cannot do is fend off the reassertion of the human condition as it has always been. Fortunately, the death of false ideas is not identical to the death of the human spirit. It rises from its own ashes. Nevertheless, it would be good to avoid recipes for the production of ash heaps where possible. Sensible politicians will do so. Philosophers cannot produce sensible politicians, but they can be irritating reminders of the limits to politics. Philosophers might notice sensible politicians and speak their praises simply by describing them. In so doing, they perform a not altogether useless task. Their task is to understand why the world is the way it is, not to postulate a program to liberate us into a world beyond change or to reach the end of history. Political philosophers, in a special sense, are thus of a conservative disposition. Now, this is not to be confused with what is currently described as conservatism, whether paleoconservatism or neoconservatism. Oakeshott's reference is specifically to a disposition from which no obvious generalizations about views on specific policy questions may be drawn. The political philosopher is not in the business of determining which ideas it may be said that their time has come or gone. This disposition reveals the nature of the skeptical way. Plans to eliminate contingency, or to give the government back to the people, or to achieve peace in our time, or to make poverty history, claim a potential for control the historical record does not support. If one were to ask Oakeshott, why ought governments to accept the current diversity of opinion and activity in preference to imposing upon their subjects a dream of their own, he would say, why not? Their dreams are no different from those of anyone else, and if it is boring to have to listen to the dream of others, it is insufferable to be forced to reenact them. We tolerate monomaniacs. It is our habit to do so, but why should we be ruled by them? Government does not begin with a vision of another different and better world, but with the observation of the self-government practiced even by men of passion in the conduct of their enterprises. The intimations of government are to be found in ritual, not in religion or philosophy, in the enjoyment of orderly and peaceful behavior, not in the search for truth or perfection. In this, we find Oakeshott's critique of the Enlightenment project and of rationalism in politics in the wake of the horrendous events of the 20th century. What then is the proper role of governing? For Oakeshott, it begins with the rule of law. Governing involves the making and ordering of rules of conduct. Rules of conduct are not prescriptions for how we ought to live. They are adverbial conditions specifying that whatever we choose to do, we must do it under certain conditions. Such conditions may help or hinder us in the pursuit of our aims. The function of the rules of conduct is neither to help nor to hinder, neither to pronounce in favor or not against particular self-chosen pursuits of individuals, but to encourage the capacity for self-regulation. Governing provides a structure of laws. When successful, it will reduce the number of unfortunate collisions among interests. It will ensure compensation for injuries. It will punish those who refuse to abide by rules of conduct. But government is not the management of an enterprise, but the rule of those engaged in a great diversity of self-chosen enterprises, not concerned with concrete persons, but with activities, not concerned with moral right and wrong, not designed to make men good or even better. Such a government seeks only necessary loyalty because it is not seeking the truth and it is not rooting out error. Such a government may expect respect, but also some suspicion, not love or devotion or affection. Now, in this, Oakeshott is describing procedural governance as the means to allow for the widest range of human self-regulation through voluntary transactions. Rules of conduct will change over time, of course. Such modifications as may be necessary should always reflect and never impose a change in the activities and beliefs of those who are subject to them, and should never on any occasion be so great as to destroy the ensemble. Even armed with this disposition, it will not necessarily be an easy or simple task to act in accord with it, to rein in one's own beliefs and desires, to acknowledge the current shape of things, to feel the balance of things, to tolerate what is abominable, to distinguish between crime and sin, to respect formality. These are difficult achievements. Reflection of this sort fosters being at home in the world. As with Montaigne, we discern a pattern of movement from natural harmony at birth to the disharmony of youthful exuberance, to the reflective return to the world which we must inhabit, and which differs from the one of our poetic images and political fantasies. There is no rule enforcing this upon us. We may experience this with greater or lesser grace, but it is the capacity to find the days of age equal to the days of youth which qualifies us for undertaking political activity. There is a parallel then between the wisdom of the philosopher and the practical insight of the mature politician, but they do not need each other to come to them. And Oakeshott thought that we should be thankful if they can live together in the same polity. Now, throughout his writings, Oakeshott explored a number of oppositions in search of mediation which characterized the modern situation. And I plan to illustrate those now. And among those oppositions are the distinction between empirical politics and ideological politics, between the politics of skepticism and the politics of faith, between what he called nomocracy and teleocracy, between the morality of habit and affection and the morality of reflective thought, and finally, the distinction between civil association and enterprise association. And I will say something about each of these oppositions and offer a tentative conclusion about what we can learn from them about our world, divided as it is, as I see it, between impatience and disillusionment. The distinction between the empirical style of politics and the ideological style of politics was a central feature of an essay called Political Education, which was Oakeshott's inaugural lecture as professor of political science at the London School of Economics, which he presented in 1951. The empirical style suggests a kind of ad hoc response to the kaleidoscopic array of issues one confronts every day, a kind of not well organized pragmatism, often generating contradictory responses. Opposing this style is the ideological style, which, impatient with the disorderly character of the prevailing order, seeks an independently designed plan for the society, a model of how one imagines the society ought to look, coupled with the demand for the power to impose that design in order to bring to an end the sloppiness of the existing situation. The opposition between the empirical and the ideological style is mediated by recognizing the possibility of an orderly but revisable set of judgments as to what it is possible to achieve, involving something like the practical judgment described by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. At about the same time in his 1951 lecture, Oakeshott was writing a book which he never published, but which came to light only after his death in 1990. The book subsequently published as The Politics of Faith and the Politics of Skepticism. The Politics of Faith describes the utopian or millennialist aspirations to direct our existence toward a final stage of harmony and relief from the ordeal of history. Marx's belief in the final withering away of the state in favor of a post-political tranquility would be one classic image of this. The Politics of Skepticism arises as a warning against concentrated centralized power exemplified in the modern constitutional state. Oakeshott thought that both of these were modern responses to the emergence of the modern state beginning about 500 years ago, setting up a polarized field of argument in which each side energizes its opposite even as it seeks to dominate. Each responded to the centralization of power in the modern state, a centralization which was beyond anything found in the pre-modern world, particularly as the technology of control expanded in unprecedented ways, an issue we currently clearly worry about, for example, in the era of the surveillance state. For Oakeshott, modern history is characterized by the unresolved opposition between the politics of faith and the politics of skepticism, which he thought was observable in all modern states. The current debate over the constitutional state versus the post-constitutional state, for example, instantiates this conflict. In his lectures on the history of political thought at the London School of Economics, Oakeshott developed a theory of law based on the opposition between nomocracy and teleocracy. The first, nomocracy, refers to the rule of law, strictly speaking, as a set of procedural norms to provide the background conditions which reinforce the capacity of individuals to interact with each other through self-regulation. Reinforced by the law, promoting mutual recognition and accommodation. The alternative, teleocracy, implies that there is a specific arrangement of human beings to be achieved, defined as an end or goal to be reached through government regulation, adjusting and directing self-regulation. This is often described nowadays as the rule of experts. In its moderate form, it advocates the use of governmental power to nudge people in the right direction through limited coercion. Current debates about the administrative state or the deep state reflect the underlying unresolved oppositions of our time. One recent legal theorist has described this opposition as the difference between the rule of law and rule through law. In his 1948 essay, The Tower of Babel, Oakeshott distinguished between the morality of habit and affection and the morality of reflective thought. He thought that in our time, we have increasingly resorted to the morality of reflective thought. This means increasing suspicion of inherited moral habits, even suspicion of all tradition altogether. In a way, this means continually second-guessing ourselves, continually questioning our motives, feeling that we cannot expect others to observe the same rules of conduct that we may continue to respect. Oakeshott thought that this must lead to a constant anxiety and unease. It is not that traditional notions of conduct disappear, but that we allow ourselves to be embarrassed by them. Finally, in On Human Conduct of 1975, Oakeshott presented the opposition between civil association and enterprise association. He thought that this was the most comprehensive description of the oppositional character of modern history, which he had been attempting to describe throughout his study of modern politics. One can see the connection of this description of the oppositionality to the other attempts that go back to his efforts, beginning with Experience and Its Modes in 1933, expressed in his 1939 book, Social and Political Doctrines of Contemporary Europe, and in his Harvard lectures of 1958, The Morality and Politics of Modern Europe. In On Human Conduct, Oakeshott elaborates at great length the distinction between a society of largely self-governing, self-regulating individuals supported by the rule of law or nomocracy, and the idea of the modern state as a managerial enterprise involving the pursuit of a single goal in which governors manage us through laws and regulations, treating us as individuals who play our roles in a vast division of labor, pointing to a unified outcome or end, at which point the conversation of mankind will become a song in unison. If we consider all these attempts, these essays, to understand ourselves in the world we inhabit, we might say that the fundamental opposition in the 21st century is between impatience with the failure of the end of history to materialize and disillusionment with the proclamation of its coming. We have become suspicious of the Enlightenment project, but we find it difficult to give it up. Like Icarus, we have flown too close to the sun. But unlike Icarus, we have survived our fall and must make sense out of what has happened to us. Thus, Oakeshott, and here I quote from his 1948 essay, The Tower of Babel. The predicament of Western morals, as I read it, is first that our moral life has come to be dominated by the pursuit of ideals, a dominance ruinous to a settled habit of behavior, and secondly, that we have come to think of this dominance as a benefit for which we should be grateful, or an achievement of which we should be proud. And the only purpose to be served by this investigation of our predicament, that is Oakeshott's investigation, is to disclose the corrupt consciousness, the self-deception which reconciles us to our misfortune. This conclusion is one aspect of Oakeshott's self-disclosure. It suggests stoic resignation regarding the human condition, since the world must be as it is and as it will come to be. Beyond that, however, there was cheerfulness and enthusiasm for life discernible in Oakeshott to anyone who actually knew him, as I fortunately did for the last 16 years of his life. This is evident in his 1929 essay, Religion in the World, an essay of remarkable interest, which unfortunately most people haven't paid that much attention to. But in that essay of 1929, he criticizes worldliness, the disposition haunted by guilt about what has passed and intense anxiety about what is to come. The result, he thought, is to depreciate the present possibilities of life, seeking perhaps desperately to live elsewhere than in the moment one has been given, which nevertheless remains inescapable. To overcome this was, I do believe, was the point of view informing Oakeshott's life work. Echoing Montaigne, Oakeshott sought to overcome the anxieties of self-consciousness through openness to the intimations of immortality, where immortality is understood not as a future state of affairs, but as the poetic experience transcending the dailiness of life. Thank you.
Oh my God. Professor, unfortunately, you cannot see everybody here, but I can see that, I can feel that everybody's paying attention to you, and we are so happy, and everybody's clapping and saying thank you. So thank you so much. We are going to the questions. I think the first question is from Professor Pondé, please.
Thank you very much for your speech, dear Professor Fuller. I would like to ask you, do you think we have nowadays any political leader in the world that could be seen as a skeptical political leader from Oakeshott's point of view? I'm going to switch to Portuguese, the question, and then you may answer, okay? Thank you very much.
Sure.
Eu perguntei ao professor Fuller se ele acha que existe, hoje em dia, no mundo, algum líder político que a gente pudesse ver como um líder político cético do ponto de vista do Michael Oakeshott. Okay, Professor, thank you.
I'm now, of course, speaking just for myself, inspired by what I was saying about Oakeshott, of course. I think it's very difficult for any political leaders today to proceed in the manner in which I've been describing. Because this is an age of ideologies, and it is an age of abstract speculation. And the more radical forms of the Enlightenment project, which people like Hume in the 18th century had already anticipated in his time, in many ways conspire against being able to lead in that way. I just look, for example, at the current political campaign in the United States, where it seems to me that you can see that neither of the presidential candidates achieve anything remotely like what I'm describing. Now, and I say this not because I want to launch some kind of critique of them. I mean, other people will do that, of course, and are doing it. It's because the circumstances in which one pursues office today often demands that one speak in exactly these ways that Oakeshott is criticizing. And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that many people, many individuals who are interested in political philosophy have accepted the idea that they should become political participants rather than philosophic analysts of what's going on. And to that extent, encourage a continual movement towards the things that Oakeshott objected to. You know, in 1939, he published a very interesting little essay called The Claims of Politics, in which he argued that for certain people, it was a responsibility not to participate in politics. And he meant people like artists, philosophers, because he thought that the renewal of civilization depended on keeping alive those elements in civilization which tend to get put aside in the heat of political debate. So I think it's extremely difficult today. And it's not because there aren't people who might be disposed to respond in the way that he describes, but the circumstances in which we find ourselves are extremely difficult to deal with. And so in a way, it really is a kind of existential choice. If you're going to participate in politics, you kind of have to put up with what the politics requires. And if you don't want to do that, then I think you can see why Montaigne retired to his tower and left the political process, having actually been a successful politician before that, and why Hume analyzed politics and didn't choose to participate in it, and why Oakeshott did the same.
Thank you.
Luis, you can go to the questions.
Okay. There's a question here, Professor, from Pedro Issa. He says, Professor Fuller, does history have a saying for the modern man in the modern world? Is there a place for historical argumentation on the political arena? Or should the study of history to be kept apart from political uses?
Well, that's a very big question. And of course, there are disputes among historians today about what the role of the study of the past is supposed to be. And to some extent, the issues that I talked about between politics and philosophy have a parallel in arguments over the role of the historian. The historian, technically speaking, is obligated to tell the story of the past insofar as the evidence of the past allows us to describe it. On the other hand, there are plenty of people who use the past in order to defend particular positions in the current state of affairs. There's a very interesting book, which some of you may know, by Herbert Butterfield, a book called The Whig Interpretation of History. Herbert Butterfield was a historian at Cambridge, actually a contemporary of Oakeshott's at Cambridge. They were quite good friends. And the Whig interpretation of history was the kind of progressive theory that the story of history is the story of continual advancement or progress of the human spirit. By contrast, someone like Oakeshott, I think, had a very Augustinian view of history, namely that history is full of illusions, which tend over time to fail. So, for example, one of the literatures that's quite interesting is the literature that compares the American role in the world today to the Roman Empire. There's a large literature on that subject, and a lot of people who ask the question whether the United States having risen to a great position in the world is on the verge of decline. But you can carry that to other societies too. I mean, obviously this was an issue in the British Empire, as is exhibited by Gibbon's famous book on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. In other words, the question of where we are in history, are we on the upswing or the downswing, is a question which I think is a natural question in an age of heightened historical consciousness, which is true of our age. From Oakeshott's point of view, the historian's task is to describe what's going on and not to engage in abstract speculations about whether history has a particular course to follow. I think he thought that to search for meaning was more likely to be in the pursuit of the poetic element of life or in the religious dimension of life, and not in speculations about history and politics. But in the current situation, there's a big dispute about what the historian's role is. And to me, it parallels very much the description I gave of the conflict over what the role of political philosophy is. And it's part of the unresolved conflict, because the disillusionment with the Enlightenment project, at the same time, the refusal to give it up, is going to affect a lot of what happens in intellectual life in virtually every field.
Thank you, Professor. Let me ask you one thing. In that article, The Political Economy of Freedom, Oakeshott says that there are two great opponents to a libertarian society, which are collectivism and syndicalism, because they represent a concentration of power which puts in danger our civil liberties. And that private property is a way of distributing this power throughout society. I was thinking about how do you see this situation where we have not this collectivism in our society, in our Western society, so this collectivism is not the main model, but there's another thing which is present in our time, which are those gigantic companies, those multinational companies. They sort of represent a kind of concentration of power that could put also this freedom in danger, right? What do you think of this? How do you see this situation?
Well, that essay is interesting because in that essay, he calls himself a libertarian.
Yeah.
As far as I know, it's the only place in his writings where he ever described himself in that way. Though a lot of what I said about him, you can see where there would be some affinity to the libertarian point of view. The other somewhat shocking thing about that essay is he says that the right of property is more important than free speech. And he makes the remark that most people don't have much of anything to say. Well, here I have to speak just for myself now in how I respond to that. It seems to me that we have evolved to a point where any modern society that is reasonably affluent has an obligation to provide what we sometimes call the social safety net. That is, some minimal responsibility for people who are in a disadvantaged situation. And that development is here to stay. And therefore, libertarianism in its strict form, which would mean minimal or practically no government, and especially government without many resources to distribute, is certainly not feasible under our circumstances. And even some of the classical liberal economists, people like Hayek, for example, argued that a society of considerable wealth did have an obligation to provide some kind of minimal provision for people in need. Which means, for example, that some radical libertarians reject him, or even Adam Smith for not being libertarian enough. But it was Adam Smith, after all, who recognized that the growth of wealth could be very good for us, but it also could be a source of corruption. Now, so I would say one other thing about the property issue. If you go back to Locke's notion of life, liberty, and property, you can see that the word property begins with the property in one's own body. And it's not just about owning material things. And so that needs to be brought into that discussion. But the other part that you mentioned is globalization. And a big question in our time is whether there are forms of political order which somehow transcend the state, the modern state, which for the last 400 years has been the principal object of investigation in world politics. And there, I think the answer is still unknown. I mean, one classic illustration of it would be the attempt of the European Union to create a new kind of political order which transcends the traditional nation-state structure of Europe. And to be perfectly honest, it's not clear to me exactly what that is going to turn out to be. And as we can see, there are stresses and strains within it. Obviously, with Brexit, for example, there are unresolved issues as to exactly what kind of political order that has the potential of becoming. And we should remember that the United States is only as unified as it is because the Civil War determined once and for all that the states that were had signed on to the Union could not secede from it, but that was decided by military force. And so that they are now irrevocably part of the Union, but that wasn't the way it was understood prior to the Civil War, when there was a big issue as to exactly what the relationship between them was. So for me right now, I would say that the modern state remains the principal unit in world politics. And the development of transnational organizations and transnational corporations is of course an unresolved issue. And the question of whether globalization is good or bad for us is one of the unresolved issues of our time. And it has obviously its defenders and its detractors. I would provisionally say, however, that to the degree that we believe we can improve the human condition depends on continued commitment to economic growth. And so one of the consequences of that continued economic growth is globalization. And while there are certain features of globalization which are dislocating and need to be treated, it seems to me that we can't really retreat from that if we want to continue to do what we can to improve the standard of living of human beings on a global scale.
Yeah, Professor, still on this subject, when we were reading this article in our research group, we were talking about also the role of state in this situation, where there are those global organizations that are so big. So we were wondering if the state could reach a size, or not a size, but I would say that he acted in more ways than Oakeshott was, prepared to to admit or to think of as a good thing. You know what I mean? So it seems that the bigger the companies or the more global the economy becomes, it seems that we need more presence of the state to balance those rules. So would
Yes,
Oakeshott danger again?
I agree with that. I think we need to remember that the context in which Oakeshott was writing was in the wake of the disastrous events of the first half of the 20th century, the rise of totalitarianism, the advent of nuclear war, the Holocaust, all those things that we're all familiar with. The things which frankly called into question the Enlightenment project and whether it could actually achieve its goals. And some of the things that we're talking about now in the 21st century were not things that were so apparent in his time as they are in our time. So the only thing I can say about him is that in my conversations with him, for example, when we would talk about the European Union, his view always was that smaller is better. That is, for him, decentralization is better than centralization. And I think he also was skeptical about measuring our progress solely in material terms, which didn't mean by any stretch that he was in favor of some kind of radical redistribution of wealth, because that requires the centralization of the state in a way that he opposed. But it seems to me that for us now in 2020, we have to deal with issues which have emerged in ways that were not apparent to the great thinkers of the 20th century when they were writing. Now, I think we just have to accept that. I think the basic ideas that Oakeshott presents about, let's say, civil versus enterprise association remain applicable to us, but they have to be put in the context of these larger phenomena that you're describing. That would get us into, if we had the time, into things like development economics, for example. I think of somebody like Amartya Sen, the great development economist who wrote a book called Development is Freedom, which argues that the two things have to go hand in hand with each other. This is being challenged by the Chinese model, which claims to approach this in a different way. You could say that what's emerging now for us are new forms of the unmediated oppositions of the kind that I was describing. And frankly, I don't know what the answer to that is, because I think we're still trying to figure out how to respond to these circumstances, but that they are fundamental to us and are going to shape the debates that we have for the next generation, I believe is absolutely true.
Thank you. Andrea?
Unmute.
No, sorry. All the books that Professor Fuller is talking about, we are putting here the link and everything together with the articles that have been translated and everything. I'm going to ask a question that I had from WhatsApp, and then there is another question from Ruth here that I'm going to ask. Okay, Luis? Because people are curious, Professor, they want to know about your relationship with Michael Oakeshott. As you said, you had the fortune to be with him for the last 16 years of his life. Mm-hmm. He died in 1990, yes?
Yeah.
And then, so people want to know about your relationship with him, and when did you make the choice to keep his work alive?
Okay, I wasn't going to talk about myself, but I will.
Okay.
My first encounter with Oakeshott was when I was a sophomore in college, because I was taking my first course in political philosophy, and I had to write a paper on Hobbes. And as you probably know, Hobbes was one of the thinkers that Oakeshott cared about a lot, and he actually wrote more about him than he did about any other political philosophers. And I went to the library of my college, and I found on the shelf his edition of the Leviathan from 1946. At that time, I knew nothing about him. But I sat down in the library and I started to read his introduction to the Leviathan. And it was such a gripping, extraordinary experience. I mean, it was such an intriguing essay that I read right through the whole thing. And you know, it's about 60 pages long. So I spent quite a lot of time on it. And when I got to the end of reading it, I said to myself, I'd like to write something like that someday. That's what I want to do. So I went to the professor that was teaching the course, and I said, do you know anything about this man named Oakeshott? And he turned out that he, my professor, was from England and had actually been an undergraduate at Cambridge and had actually attended Oakeshott's lectures. And so he turned out to know a lot about Oakeshott. And I said to him, remember, I'm 18 now when I'm saying this, I said, I want to study political philosophy and teach it. And my professor was very nice about it. He said, well, that's a noble thing. And he smiled a bit, but that's what I ended up doing, and I'm still doing it. So then I followed his work, and when I was in graduate school, the Rationalism and Politics essays were originally published. As you know, I later on did a new edition of that work with other essays added to it. But originally I read the first edition, which came out in 1962. Yes, that's the book. And that rekindled my interest in his work. And then in 1974, when I was a young professor at Colorado College, that was the 100th anniversary of the founding of Colorado College, 1974. And I was asked to set up a series of lectures on liberal arts education. And having read Oakeshott's work, I knew that he'd written quite a bit on education, although that was not the part of his work that was most widely known, but I had pursued it and I knew this. And so I wrote to him and asked him if he would come to the college and give the first lecture in this series. And he agreed to come. And this was in September of 1974. He arrived at the college. He spent a week at the college. He gave the lecture called A Place of Learning, which is the first essay in the Voice of Liberal Learning volume of his essays, which was the first of his works that I edited. And it was during that week that he and I got to know each other, and we liked each other immediately and became friends. And from that point forward, I went on to visit him in England every year, and was very fortunate to become part of the circle, the Oakeshott Circle in London. And that's how that relationship began. And then in 1982, he came back to the college and received an honorary degree from us, and we spent some more time together. Then the other thing that happened was that in 1987, Alan Bloom had published a book called The Closing of the American Mind, which was a big diatribe about what was wrong with higher education. And I said to Oakeshott, by this point, of course, he's quite along in years. And I said to him, you know, there's a lot of debate in the United States right now about the fate of higher education. And you have written a lot of essays on education, which most people don't know about. And I think you should bring them together in a book. And he said, that's a good idea. I'm not going to do it. You do it. And that's how I began the process of editing his works. And that book, of course, came out in 1989. And then that's it. And has remained in print ever since. And became quite a significant contribution to the philosophy of education. And the essay on a place of learning is widely reprinted wherever philosophy of education is taught. And so briefly, I never believed, let me put it this way, when I was 18, that being intrigued by this essay on Hobbes by somebody I'd never heard of before named Oakeshott, that I would someday become not only a friend, but the editor of his papers. But that's the story. I consider it kind of providential in a way. It's like it was something that was meant to happen, though I had no anticipation of it when I started out in that direction. That's the story.
I think people, some people may call it a gossip, but people are so curious about these stories, and they are really nice and hopeful, because some people from our research groups, they are really young, they are 18 and 19, and they want to be and they have dreams like this one. So yeah. I think it's wonderful to listen to this. Thank you so much.
Well, Luis, I encourage them to pursue their dreams, as Oakeshott himself certainly would.
Fantastic, thank you. Luis, can you go to the last question? So sorry.
Okay. Time is ending. You know, again, Professor, as you had your own experience, Professor Pondé was responsible to present me to Oakeshott. So again, I'm like, in my own way, following your steps with my friend here and my teacher. You know, when it was you were mentioned that article, The Claims of Politics, which was written in 1939, right?
Yes.
I was thinking, and we were discussing, we were debating the meaning of this article, but I would like to bring in one specific point of view, which is in this article, Oakeshott, he rejects this over-politicization of our life, right? Like if politics was the most important thing to which we could dedicate our time.
Right.
And you mentioned it, right, in your comment. And but I tend to think that in our time, this concern of Oakeshott really become our reality, right? If we consider our social media environment, all what this means today, the over-polarization that it brought to our society. I think in America it's happening right now. In Brazil, it's the same thing. People are polarized, and people can talk about and what divides us and what divides people. Divided, in a family lunch, politics is dividing people.
Yeah.
So it seems that it's this warning of Oakeshott is becoming our daily experience, and it's so I don't know how to express that, but we are really concerned that this reality will put us apart. Yeah. I don't know what you think about it. That article really touched me, because of this daily experience that we have been having this last year and etc. What do you think of that, Professor?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree. I think that is a big issue. for you and for us, and obviously in Europe as well. And I think some of the things that I referred to in my talk illustrate why this would happen. What he called the morality of reflective thought, which in practice leads to being suspicious of everybody's motives. So that what he called the conversation of mankind is replaced by polarized arguments. Now, in the largest sense, he thought that modern civilization is based on a certain kind of polarization, say between the politics of faith and the politics of skepticism. But in my opinion, at this moment for us, the politics of faith has dominated to a much greater extent over the politics of skepticism. At the same time that the people who are committed to radical transformation of society must have an underlying fear that they're not going to be able to achieve that radical transformation. So on the one hand, they remain devoted to doing it, but underlying it is a fear that they're not going to be able to do it. And so they look for people to blame for the failure of the revolution to be completed. And that leads to conspiracy theories and to name calling and all the things that we're now familiar with in modern political life. And I think you're right that the belief that politics is the most important thing in life is part of the responsibility for it. And I have to say that one of the things that worries me about colleges and universities, certainly in the United States, is that many academics have bought into this idea that their task as professors is to lead the transformation of the human condition as if they had some kind of special insight into it, which, and here I agree with Oakeshott, which I don't believe they actually have. So what to do about it? Well, the problem is that some people decide that the way to respond to it is to enter into the political fray and to politicize the goal of limiting politicization, which of course paradoxically means contributing to politicalization rather than diminishing it. So from an Oakeshottian point of view, the task is to refuse to do that and have the courage to say, there's something else that's really important and I am not going to play this game. But of course, we know that once we do that, we're also going to be the object of considerable criticism and attack. Now, Oakeshott certainly in his lifetime knew that. One thing you can say for him, though, is that he was quite courageous. You know, he never backed down from the views that he held. And I guess what I say for us is we need to have the courage not to back down from our understanding of the situation. But I recognize that that's asking people to do quite a lot. I hope that I'm up to the task myself.
Wow. Thank you very much, Professor. That was a great answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Andrea.
Yes. Well, we are, it's almost, well, I would like to thank you, Professor, first of all, for such an honor. It was a great opportunity to have you here. There are many people here congratulating you and thanking for this opportunity. So I would like to say thank you to our audience here, and I'm going to say some of their names. Obrigada, Juliana, Ruth, Flavinha, Dani, a Soraya, Elvira, o Carlos. Heraldo colocou todos os links, Lucas, Alexandre, Nádia, Bruno, Edward, Neuza, Pedro. Well, there are many people here. So thank you so much, Professor, again, for being with us here in São Paulo. We hope to meet you here one day, maybe when everything, this nightmare is over.
Yeah.
And thank you, Luis Bueno. Thank you, Luis Felipe Pondé.
Well, let me just say that I'd be happy to hear from any of you. If you have any further questions, I'm always happy to respond.
Thank you. There are many people asking some things and saying how fantastic your thoughts are, and they are going to read so many things now because you gave them so many ideas. So thank you so much. Muito obrigada, gente. Boa noite. Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Best to you all.
Thank you.